Good morning, comrades. It is Sunday morning. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but it's a little bit dark here in London. We are going to be hearing this morning from Marcus Strom. Um, I think there isn't anything you need me to tell people, is there, Marcus? No? Okay.
I will share my screen and start some
Okay.
slides.
Yeah, we just give it a
Excellent.
couple of seconds to.
Okay. Well, it's dark here in Sydney because it's nighttime. So as well. So
But is it raining and snowing?
it's been raining, but it's summer.
The screen is yours, Marcus.
Thank you, comrades. Hopefully you can see the slide and see me. So welcome to this session of Winter Communist University, although it's summer for me. And thank you for the invitation to speak on AUKUS and the coming war with China. My name's Marcus Strom. I'm speaking very much in a personal capacity. I'm a member of the Australian Labor Party and I'm national convener of Labor Against War, which is the national organisation within the Labor Party opposing AUKUS and a drift to war with China. Today, I mostly want to look at this through the transition of geopolitics between the United States as the major global power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think most people will remember this photograph of George Bush declaring mission accomplished in the war against Iraq. The 1990s and into the early noughties saw the United States around with Bush's figurehead around a real drive for a neocon evangelism, where the United States would use power, including military power, such as it did in Iraq, to push what it saw as the democratization of countries, and it thought Iraq would bloom into a democratic renaissance. Of course, nothing of the sort happened, and that new American Century project around a bunch of neocons like Richard Pearl here, David Frum, Ken Alderman. They thought that they'd have a cakewalk against Saddam, and then they would unleash democracy in the Middle East. That was their focus, to use their untrammeled position of global power to unroll what it saw as democracy, i.e. winning regimes for US interest across the world, starting in the Middle East. And that really fell apart in the global war on terror, the rise of ISIS, and the what we've seen since, and we're seeing echoes of that now, really, in Israel's war of expansion. Towards the late 90s, a new approach started to emerge to ensure US global hegemony. And the textbook of this, and you can actually go to the CIA website and download this book. It's Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. I'll be using this book, which I've read a few times. It's worth reading. It's a very honest appraisal of the role of the United States as the only global superpower. Brzezinski says that the United States is the world's first such global superpower. and probably its last. And he's got towards the end of the book, he's got a fantasy that eventually, under the grand tutelage of US imperial power, and he doesn't shirk from using the word imperial power, a world at peace with itself will eventually emerge where the United States will no longer need to be the global hegemon. It's a very idealistic understanding. So we've got Brzezinski in a nutshell. He says that the last decade of the 20th century has witnessed a tectonic shift in world affairs. For the first time ever, a non-Eurasian power has emerged not only as the key arbiter of Eurasian power relations, but as the world's paramount power. American foreign policy must remain concerned with the geopolitical dimension and must employ its influence in Eurasia in a manner that creates a stable continental equilibrium with the United States as the political arbiter. Eurasia is thus the chessboard on which the struggle for global primacy continues to be played, and that struggle involves geostrategy, the strategic management of geopolitical interests. Most of the book deals with NATO expansion, deals heavily with Ukraine. It's here that the idea that Russia, in order to engage with the world, needs to decentralize into three regional areas: a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, and a Pacific or Eastern Russia, which is kind of a breakup of Russia thesis. So we have a single state as the truly global power. He sees control of Eurasia and the island, the world island, as the central point, but this is being done from a non-Eurasian power. And he says the most immediate task is to make certain that no state or combination of states gains the capacity to expel the United States from Eurasia or to diminish significantly its decisive arbitrating role. Now, I think that some of Brzezinski's tenets and suggestions fell by the wayside, but I think this remained and remains at the center of US foreign policy. It, through manifest destiny, through seeing itself as the harbinger of democracy, enlightenment to the world, sees that it needs to maintain this role globally. He does deal quite a bit with China in the book towards the end. He says that China is emerging as a regionally dominant power. It is not likely to become a global one for a long time, but he means like hundreds of years potentially. And paranoid fears of China as a global power are breeding megalomania in China, while perhaps also becoming the source of a self-fulfilling prophecy of intensified American-Chinese hostility. He says that China should be neither contained nor propitiated, which means lauded. I think the self-fulfilling prophecy of an intensified American-Chinese hostility has occurred, and we've seen a shift from what Brzezinski was advocating to actually a new position of containing China, which is now paramount. Brzezinski also said the prevailing wisdom that China is the next global power, breeding paranoia and fostering megalomania, fears of an aggressive and antagonistic China that before long is destined to be the next global power, are at best premature and at worst become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It follows that it would be counterproductive to organize a coalition designed to contain China's rise to global power. That would only ensure that a regionally influential China would be hostile. Well, I think that has come to pass, and we'll go through why and what role AUKUS is playing in that. Brzezinski's central warning in the book is the most dangerous scenario that could evolve is a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. It would be reminiscent in scale and scope to that once posed by the Sino-Soviet bloc, though this time China would be the leader and Russia the follower. Averting this contingency, however remote it may be, will require a display of US geostrategic skill on the western, eastern, and southern perimeters of Eurasia simultaneously. Now, while China, Russia, and Iran have not emerged as a coalition, I think given what has happened in the Ukraine war, the relations between Russia and China, Iran providing weapons systems to Russia for that war, I think this most dangerous scenario from a US point of view is potentially there. So I think what fundamentally shifted from 1997 when Brzezinski wrote that and then into the new millennium was the shock of the global financial crisis in 2008. China was also impacted by the GFC, but less than the advanced economies. And China emerged from the GFC as the second largest economy. I think 2009-10 is kind of when that occurred. I suppose a bit of a self-criticism from my opening I gave at Communist University in August. If comrades who were there might remember that I presented a sort of a timeline going back to 1000 AD, Common Era, that showed that China and India were the dominant economies and centers of industry and agriculture up until about 1500, and that with the rise of capitalism in Europe, that dropped off, and then the impact of imperialism itself and colonialism into China saw that drop off, and that suppose an implication by that is that this is an aberration and that China and India, to an extent, returning to its dominant place, given its population centers and history and culture, is somehow inevitable. But I think I don't think I said that explicitly, but I perhaps made that implication. And I don't think that is right. I don't think there's anything natural or inevitable that China will just return to that place because of its population. And I think we need to look deeper at the class nature of China, what's going to happen with China, and the potential for any war that could break out as well. So after 2008, we saw the election of Barack Obama. Also in Australia, the election of a Labor government in 2007, with a Prime Minister in Australia, Kevin Rudd, who's now Australia's Foreign Minister to the United States, fluent in Chinese, much more open to engagement with China. We had, after the global financial crisis, and through Obama declared himself to be America's first Pacific president, partly a play on the fact he was born in Hawaii, but also the fact that there's a shift now going to take place in US foreign policy. And he formally made this announcement in the Australian Parliament in November 2011. And this was part of a grand tour he made in 2011 on the back of an article in Foreign Policy by Hillary Clinton called America's Pacific Century. And in that speech that he gave in the Australian Parliament, he said that there would be a broad shift in US policy. As a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long-term role in shaping this region and its future by upholding core principles, bullshit about, human rights, universal human values, etc., etc. And he pointedly said, as we end today's wars, meaning in Iraq and Afghanistan, I have directed my national security team to make our presence and mission in the Asia Pacific a top priority. As a result, reductions in US defense spending will not come at the expense of the Asia Pacific. So this was a policy of hostile engagement with China. Writing in Foreign Policy that year, Clinton said that there would be 6 key lines of action to what has become known as the pivot to Asia: strengthening bilateral security alliances, which I think is very relevant in terms of understanding AUKUS, deepening our working relationships with emerging powers, including China, engaging with regional multilateral institutions, And in the meantime, we've seen the emergence of the Quad, which is the US, Australia, Japan, and India, again to circle China, expanding trade and investment, and forging a broad-based military presence, advancing democracy and human rights. That is what Clinton outlined for Obama's pivot. Speaking after the Labor lost power, Kevin Rudd said that pivot is an entirely appropriate move, and without such a move, there was a danger China, with its hardline, realist view of international relations, would conclude an economically exhausted United States was losing its staying power in the Pacific. After that, we have COVID, which I think was an important trigger, and it coincided with Trump's first go in the White House. The rhetoric and the bellicosity towards China ramped up considerably in this period. At the time, Scott Morrison attacked China, calling for inquiries into China's potential releasing of a virus. China retaliated by a lot of sanctions against Australia on beef, lobsters famously. The price of lobsters dropped incredibly in Australia right before Christmas one year. Everyone was going out buying cheap lobsters because of this. And in May 2020, the US, under Trump, a document was produced called US Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China. And it basically said, up until then, policies for some sort of engagement, as hostile as it was under Obama, had failed, and then we needed to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades, policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. Basically, they were saying China's acting on its own, its acceptance into the World Trade Organization regime, everything else we've done, China keeps acting independently and is pushing its area of interest without consultation with the United States. So US NATO backing for a war in Ukraine, combined with the Trump-esque ramping up of conflict with China, that I think Biden and Albanese softened but didn't shift, places us partly in the frame of Brzezinski's most dangerous scenario, and increasingly war is seen as inevitable with China. Of course, we've got the return tomorrow of Trump in the White House. So some have argued that this means we've returned to a period of Great War politics more akin to the lead up to World War I than a new Cold War. But I think this is not right, in the sense that, well, in World War I, the power differentials between Germany and Britain, France, Russia were not as extreme as they are between US and everybody else. There are not multiple imperial empires contesting for resources as there was in the lead up to World War I. But what we are seeing definitely is the unraveling of the post-World War II global system of international affairs, which euphemistically is called the rules-based international order, which of course was always rubbish. The United States always played by its own rules within that system, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it was used as a battering ram against anyone who would balk against US hegemony. But we're seeing that fall apart, and this will accelerate under Trump, it seems, with his talks of annexing Greenland and Panama and using economic coercion against Canada, to renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, saying it had a beautiful ring to it. So that is the period we seem to be entering. So this period of 21st century imperialism, and I think I know Mike I watched Mike McNair's talk from the other day, and where he referred back to his series on imperialism, which is worth revisiting. Just get some water. The open and at times brutal exercise of power by the global imperialist order, whether in Gaza, Yemen, NATO expansion in Europe, various saber rattling, France in Africa, etc., has created an illusion that some sort of multipolar world against this unipolar US world would be a progressive challenge to US imperialism. I think this is a common sort of left liberal idea now. I think we see it in a lot of the Palestine solidarity work. It's kind of common sense in some elements of the left that multipolarity would be better and more democratic than unipolarity. Of course, ignoring the polar power potential of the working class, which is absent from all of this chessboard at the moment. So China and Russia, not least through BRICS, are promoting this worldview, which is gaining some traction. And we see this with the re-emergence of sort of neo-Maoist or third worldist ideas on the left that I think are popular in some elements. Small, but something of a small renaissance. I just want to emphasize, I don't think these are Marxist ideas for a working class-led global opposition to modern imperialism. Absent from Brzezinski's chessboard, of course, is the independent action of the working class. But I also think it's absent from this multipolar world view of geopolitics that we must back. It's an anti-imperialism of fools, and Yasmin has written and spoken on this as well. So this is the context I think that AUKUS originated. Of course, AUKUS stands for Australia, United Kingdom, United States. Seen in some T-shirts and posters, not enough, but seen around is the slogan "AUKUS will fuck us." So this is AUKUS emerged in this context of a desire to contain China more aggressively than had been. It coincided with conservative regimes in Canberra, London, and Washington. The original architects were former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, Boris Johnson, and Scott Morrison, the former Liberal Party Prime Minister. Of course, it's been happily continued by Biden, Starmer, and Albanese, the sort of liberal left oppositions to the Conservatives. Strangely, Johnson in his recent memoirs said that a big motivating factor for him for AUKUS was revenge on Macron, who was trying to destabilize Britain because of the Brexit exit. I'm not sure how true this is because, Boris Johnson said it, so got to take it with a degree of skepticism. But he did say he didn't think AUKUS would have been possible for the UK Foreign Office to have done within the European foreign and security policy as it was previously constituted before Brexit. I thought he said that in 2023, speaking to the Hudson Institute. Now, this photo you see is from the G7 in 2021. And so this was to ensure that Biden was on board with Pompeo's idea. And they had a secret meeting at Carbis Bay in England. And they had to make sure that they weren't rumbled by the French, is what Boris Johnson said. Because up to then, Australia had a 50 billion Australian dollar submarine deal with France to provide 12 diesel-powered submarines. So they announced the AUKUS Pact, and it all went, as Johnson says, predictably tonto in Paris. Now, later on at another global summit, an Australian journalist approached Macron and sought him out, and the journalist asked, "Do you think that Scott Morrison was lying to you?" And he famously retorted, "I don't think, I know." So that was seen as a real snub to French imperial designs in the Pacific. So what is AUKUS? So AUKUS pledged Australia to fork out funds approaching $500 billion over 3 decades to underpin the US and UK flagging defence industrial base and to bankroll a new British design nuclear submarine, which may or may not arrive. So the idea is for Australia to get 8 of these nuclear submarines by the 2040s. In the interim, there would be 3 nuclear submarines bought/borrowed from the United States, Virginia class, before the arrival of the new AUKUS class nuclear submarine. They would not be nuclear weapons capable, is the plan. So in Australia, Labor Prime Minister Albanese champions it as a job creator, but at $18 million a job, 20,000 jobs for 368 billion Australian dollars plus. It's got to be the worst employment creation scheme in history. And we've already seen that the first jobs it's underpinning are in San Diego. $10 billion has gone to the US and UK already from Australian taxpayers to underpin the US defence industrial base. So this was pillar 1 of AUKUS. There's also a second pillar which is about Australian science, plugging that into the service of AUKUS military priorities, pillar 2. So the idea of pillar 2 is to make dual-use military technologies of the AUKUS countries interoperable in these areas: undersea capabilities, quantum science, artificial intelligence and autonomy, advanced cyber, hypersonics and counter-hypersonics, and electronic warfare. This is with the explicit aim to reduce the significant lead China has in these technologies. Now, I'm not sure how much of a significant lead China has in all those, but it is certainly equal to the Western countries in a lot of these technologies. In February last year, Australia passed the Defence Trade Controls Bill. Similar bills were passed in Britain and United States to lock these dual-use technologies and research between these countries. It is a crime to talk to scientists outside of Australia, the US and UK on some of this research. A last-minute intervention by the Australian Academy of Science exiles basic research from these controls. But if you're beginning to commercialize any of it, even if it's dual use, so even if you're working on the peaceful use of some of these technologies, not the military use, you come under this licensing agreement. And it was already difficult enough to work with Chinese or Iranian scientists in these areas, but now you'll need licenses and permits to work with scientists from New Zealand, from Canada, from Germany, from the Netherlands in these areas. So, however, we've now got AUKUS 2.0 from August last year. This is because the Pentagon is way behind its schedule to build its nuclear submarine fleet. So either the existing Virginia class, which Australia is meant to get 3 to 5 of, or the new Columbia class fleet, which is being built. So selling or leasing 3 to 5 Virginia class submarines to Australia is no longer palatable in the Pentagon, and they're looking for a way to get around this. And one of the US Congress publishes a lot of these research papers, which you couldn't get in Britain or Australia, which have more secretive parliamentary systems than even the United States does. So AUKUS 2.0 was signed last August. What it now gives is the US and the UK can give 1-year notice to opt out of AUKUS altogether. So if it knows it's not going to be able to deliver the submarines, it can just pull the plug. The updated agreement also indemnifies the United States and the United Kingdom from any liability, loss, cost, or damage, including to third parties arising from nuclear risks, makes Australia responsible for all the nuclear waste. And in a letter that Biden sent to Congress recommending this treaty, it wasn't provided anywhere else, but it was in this letter, which was a public letter to Congress. Australia provided, quote, additional related political commitments. These have remained secret. Now, most pundits think that what this is to do with is to do with if there's a war with China, the United States can recall these subs if an Australian government is not willing to use them in any military conflict. No one's denied this. Of course, these remain secret clauses. We don't know. But that is the most likely nature of these political commitments. The other, I've just got there at the bottom, the AUKUS 2.0, we now see Scott Morrison, the former Prime Minister who attended Donald Trump's New Year's Eve party, and Pompeo, they've all set up companies together to grift on AUKUS. They're all going to make lots of money out of it. And I don't think you can, a lot of this is to do with profit making in the military industrial complex as well, for people to grift off it. So Australia is a middle imperialist power, Australia was born as a colonial, genocidal and imperial operation. Since federation of the colonial states in 1901 and just before in 1899, Australia has engaged in every major imperialist military adventure. The Boer War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Malaya, Vietnam, Gulf War I, Afghanistan, Iraq War, and is now involved in coordinating naval attacks against Yemen. Australia, including the current Labor leadership, sees it must be an outpost of the US empire for its security in Asia. Anthony Albanese was asked why he's choosing the United States amid rising tensions in the region. And he said, well, I haven't made this choice. Australia made this choice in 1942. And that refers to the abandonment of Singapore by Churchill and the British, and Australia having to turn to the United States in the Pacific theatre for it in the war against Japan. Briefly, I'd say in the 1990s under Paul Keating, he tried to reposition Australia as a minor power of a nationalist nature to engage with Asia. He's still at that in terms of his strong opposition to AUKUS. But Albanese has said that his worldview sees world divided between a democratic and authoritarian world, and we are in the democratic world. That is how it's being presented. That has been contested by a minority nationalist pro-Asian engagement element in the ruling class that calls for getting rid of AUKUS, for replacement with a more manageable non-nuclear submarine fleet, and a positive engagement with Asia. This has an echo on the left, which does not have its own program for working class power, for working class foreign and defence policy beyond some sort of liberalism. So since the election of a Labor government in Australia in nearly 3 years ago, Australia has mollified its relations with China, but increased its soft power diplomacy to exclude China from small Pacific powers as much as possible. Australia is active in Fiji, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, all around the Pacific to try to make sure there are in defence and security relations in place that exclude China. Papua New Guinea, the rugby league is almost a religion in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea was an Australian colony until 1974. Papua New Guinea is huge there, and it has just been granted access to join a team into the Australian Rugby League competition on the condition it doesn't engage China in any of its security arrangements. So it is open blackmail that is being used there. So Obama and Biden's Asia guru, outgoing US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, he's described the AUKUS agreement as getting Australia off the fence, and we have locked them in now for the next 40 years. That means locking Australia into any military engagement with China for the next 4 decades. The Liberal opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has said of a Chinese military takeover of Taiwan and a US response, it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't support the US in an action if the US chose to take that action. He's kind of wound some of that back. There's going to be an election is due in Australia in by May. It hasn't been called yet. Dutton says that everything that the Labor Party has done in government is terrible, apart from AUKUS. So the US clearly expects any AUKUS submarines will form part of a US military engagement with China over Taiwan or other issues. I think it's important to remember AUKUS is more than just subs. Obviously, it's tying in the military research that scientific research shouldn't be for peace and human benefit, but is being subordinated to military science. The chances of the Virginia-class submarines coming is shrinking, but I don't think it was ever really about the subs. Likelihood that the UK shipyards will be able to build 5 or more new AUKUS class submarines is anyone's guess, but the British don't have a good track record in terms of delivering on this. AUKUS was never primarily about submarines. It's about shifting Australia to being a forward operations base for projecting American power into Asia. And for that, I think it's mission accomplished. There's an institute in Australia called the Lowy Institute, and it takes opinion polls of attitudes to China in Australia over the last, I think, 15 to 20 years. And from about 2012 onwards, there was a generally positive attitude towards China in Australia. That has flipped completely over. So the Australian population is generally skeptical and fearful of engagement with China. However, in terms of AUKUS, because of the size of it, in terms of the cost of it, there are about a third of Australians in opinion polls who support AUKUS, a third who think maybe we need the subs, but it's too expensive, and a third who oppose. Of course, in any military engagement that would occur, any war that emerges, that would be completely obliterated as jingoism and nationalism would take over, you would expect. B-52s have started flying through Tyndall in the Northern Territory, including for raids on Yemen fairly recently, increase in Marines in Darwin. The submarine base in Western Australia known as Stirling has now started seeing high rotation of US nuclear submarines, including potentially nuclear armed ones. And part of AUKUS is for an East Coast nuclear submarine base. That has not been announced because wherever that is, there will bound to be community and union opposition to where that is. Australia has committed to building, buying and basing hypersonic missiles, both within Australia, but also on its fleet. And it is about containing China within what is known as the first island chain. So if you see there, these are US bases or bases where US has access around China, plus the contested reefs in the South China Sea. The dotted line is what's known as the first island chain, which the idea is the United States since the 1970s has wanted to make sure that China could not operate freely its navy outside that chain. Obviously, China is contesting that. Within Brzezinski's book, he says that China's traditionally only been a land power, not a sea power, but we're seeing its transition from really only being a land power into being a sea power, and that this containment is about resisting that shift. So I'm not a China expert. I do know a lot about AUKUS, but I don't know, it's anyone's guess what China's aims are, but I think generally it wants to establish itself as the main regional power in East Asia. It wants to absorb Taiwan peacefully if it can, but is prepared to use force. It wants to control its seaplanes without intimidation or interference by the United States and its allies, particularly in the South China Sea, which is contested between Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and so on. We see it as a land power becoming a sea power. Wants to continue its economic rise through BRICS, etc., is looking for the erosion of the US dollar dominance. It obviously wants to avoid internal collapse and division from its growth. It's using what is known as the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a whole lot of unilateral agreements with countries in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia in particular, some in Latin America, for infrastructure development from China, to tie those countries' development into Chinese interests. Whether that is a form of imperialism and export of capital, I think, is open for debate. But I'm going to come to what we think China is towards the end. Obviously, China needs resources. It has not a monopoly, but it has a dominant access and manufacture and mining of rare earth elements, which is partly, there are a number of these supposedly within Greenland as well, which might be behind what Trump's up to. And it's trying to get access to Africa, which it has been doing. So I'll just go back to Brzezinski again on China. And I think this is China, how it sees itself as a fall from greatness over the last 150 years. It's humiliation. It sees it as an aberration and a desecration of China's special qualities. And it has to be erased, and its perpetrators deserve punishment. And it sees these perpetrators as Britain, Japan, Russia, and America. And in the book, he says that Britain has basically been with the hand back of Hong Kong, has no longer has basically had its comeuppance. Russia has had its fall, but America and Japan remain a thorn in its side. And he quotes a Chinese Foreign Ministry analyst in 1995, and I think this is true, that the US strategic aim is to seek hegemony in the whole world, and it cannot tolerate the appearance of any big power on the European and Asian continents that will constitute a threat to its leading position. And Brzezinski argues that China's long-term aim is to dilute American regional power to the point that a diminished America will come to need a regionally dominant China as an ally and eventually possibly as a partner. So there seems to be a bit of an obsession with 2027 in US planning and defense circles. This has been reported in Defense News and elsewhere. CIA Director Bill Burns in 2023 said that according to their intelligence, President Xi has instructed the PLA leadership to be ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan. He said this on television. That doesn't mean he's decided to invade, but that year or any other year. And there was a leaked memo in 2023 from the head of Air Mobility Command of the United States Air Force. He said, "I hope I'm wrong, but my gut tells me we will fight China in 2025." Whether this was a deliberate leak or an accidental leak, and whether he really believes that is anyone's game. But there's clearly a ratcheting up of militarism in terms of engagement with China. China, I would argue, wants to avoid a direct confrontation with the US, but it is preparing for one. US is preparing for a regional military conflict with China. Increasingly, some war planners believe this is inevitable. You know, the World War I effect. If it's inevitable, then if people are preparing for it and increasingly seeing it as inevitable, then there's potentially a first mover advantage. And you would think it would be in the US interest for it to be earlier rather than later, because the longer the US waits, the more prepared and better armed China will be. Now, people cite what's called the Thucydides trap, that historically where you have a fading power and a rising power, war is inevitable. But I do think this is a gross simplification. Sparta facing a rising Athens meant that the Peloponnesian Wars were inevitable, is what this refers to. I think this is partly used by people like Boris Johnson and others to pretend or prove that they've read something in ancient Greek. But I think it's forming a gross simplification of the geostrategic power. And we need to remember war is a continuation of policy by other means, which Mike took us through on Friday, your time, I think it was. But nonetheless, people are preparing for war. In September, the US Navy Chief of Naval Operations released a new navigation plan for America's warfighting strategy. It states that its North Star is, quote, readiness for sustained high-end joint and combined combat by 2027. And the plan drives towards two strategic ends: readiness for the possibility of war with China by 2027 and enhancing the Navy's long-term advantage. And just in case you're mistaken of how serious they are, I've just got an image. That's what its front page looks like, just to sort of hit you in the face with a bit of brutal military hardware. So Trump's impact, what will that be? So there was some in Australia, probably elsewhere, hope that Trump's isolationism could derail AUKUS, but that was never my position. I've always thought Trump would think this is a fantastic model. As Paul Keating, the former Australian Prime Minister, said, you know, we're the chumps who are paying for everything, so why wouldn't Biden and Johnson be smiling at the signing ceremony with Albanese? Because Albanese is the guy who's paying for everyone's bill. So AUKUS planning started under Trump, and it suits his transactional approach to international relations. Incoming Secretary of State Marco Rubio has recently said AUKUS could be a blueprint for other partnerships to take on China. And I think that's right. Trump expects its allies to pay for US protection. He basically sees himself as running a protection racket, which to some extent he is. And he started demanding 5% of GDP by NATO countries on defence, which has been embraced by social imperialists like Paul Mason and others. And the protectionism that Trump is going to bring in, is promising to bring in against China, as he calls it, could act as an accelerant on this. But this has already started under Biden with AUKUS, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act. America feels vulnerable, particularly on semiconductors and other technological areas, and is bringing a lot of that capacity back on shore. It recently trumpeted a deal it had with Biden, I think last year. They got a massive investment from a South Korean chip manufacturer to build manufacturing capacity in the United States, which is a big win for them. So is there an anti-war movement? At present, the left is at an historic low ebb, I would argue. The activist left in Australia, and I would assume Britain and the United States, has been focused on endless Palestine solidarity demonstrations. But because of the strategy, even of those demonstrations, they haven't led to a general political movement emerging from that, even though you've got Gaza and you've got AUKUS and an anti-imperialism you would think would be emerging from that, but there's no general political framework contesting that because of I think the hyper focus on activism. There's certainly been no partyist impetus from the left. Here and there, you've seen some independents elected. I think in Britain, I think you had about 5 pro-Palestine independents, but there's been no general political upsurge from the Palestine solidarity movement. The framework for most of anti-AUKUS work is, in Australia at least, and I would assume elsewhere, still in the hands of veterans from the anti-Iraq war movement. Most young people who are engaging in politics for the first time on the left are going to the Palestine demonstrations, understandably, given there's a genocide and it's obvious. I would say in Australia, the unions are not centrally engaged. Some of them are, and I'm not sure what it is in the United States. I would imagine most of the unions are pro-military, and I don't know, be good to hear comrades in Britain any unions there have said anything about AUKUS. But we do need to develop a working class policy on defence and foreign relations, which doesn't exist. It's not even really seen as an idea on the left that we should have our own independent foreign policy or defence policy. I thought it'd be interesting to also have a debate. What is our attitude to Taiwan? So the formal position of all interested parties seems to be the same. Taiwan is part of China with a one China policy. That's the policy of the United States. It's the policy of the European Union, of Britain. It's the policy of Beijing. It's the policy of Taipei. Formal stance of the Constitution of the Republic of China. Australia signed a joint communique with People's Republic of China in 1972. That is still cited as the basis of Australia's foreign policy towards China. It recognised the Beijing government as China's sole legal government and acknowledged the position of that government that Taiwan was a province of China. Didn't agree with it, but it does acknowledge it. So what is our attitude? And I think as Marxists, we favour the voluntary unity of peoples, not the forced unification of people. So I don't think we're banner wavers for Xi Jinping to invade Taiwan in some sort of Chinese nationalist move. I think events in Hong Kong have been impacting attitudes in Taiwan as well. Hong Kong was, you remember, I think it was Deng Xiaoping and others who said that there would be one country and two systems. Over time, Hong Kong's independence and ability to have a different system has been gradually eroded by Beijing. The British imperialists have discovered the idea that democracy for Hong Kong would be a good idea, although it didn't seem to think it was a good idea when Britain ruled Hong Kong. So I think we have to see through a lot of that smoke, that imperialist smoke about rights for Hong Kong and Taiwan. But I don't think it should blind us to the idea that we are for the voluntary unity of peoples. We just had elections last year where the DPP in Taiwan won, who's more favours independence, but with a parliament that was more Kuomintang, so which is for improved relations with Beijing. But I would think if there was a war, and it'd be interesting to test this against your next session, which I'll be asleep for, but when Lars is talking about revolutionary defeatism, how does revolutionary defeatism work if there is a hot war with the United States Britain and Australia going to war with China over Taiwan? I would say we would want the defeat of US imperialism. That's hard to see, but what that is a track in attitudes in Taiwan from 1994 to 2024, attitudes to independence. The top line, which is black, is basically maintain status quo, decide later on. The blue line, which is punched up to the top, is maintain status quo indefinitely, i.e. let's not even talk about it. I know people who have family in Taiwan, and I mean, life continues normally in Taiwan, and they really just don't, a lot of people just don't want to know about it. The green line, which has punched up as well, is maintain status quo and move towards independence. And the red line, not the very bottom red line, which 1% of people, unification as soon as possible. But there's a slightly higher red line at about 6%, which is status quo with a move towards unification.
Sorry, Marcus, but you've stopped sharing.
Have I?
So we can't see the red line and the green.
No, we can see it still. Yasmin, might be your.
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Because I'm still sharing. I'll be finishing within a couple of minutes, few minutes. So this is a graph showing arms sales to Taiwan. It says, this is from the Council on Foreign Relations, saying there's significant under all administrations, but you can see a spike under the two Bushes. Obama continued with the late Bush spike. Trump really punched it up. But interestingly, military aid, this is military sales, not military aid. Military aid to Taiwan ended in the late 1970s when US recognized Beijing, and there was no military aid to Taiwan until very recently when it started to punch up again. So what if war erupts? The US and China are clearly preparing for conflict. That conflict would be a continuation of the politics of the US seeking to guarantee its global hegemonic position, and also to brook no rise of significant regional powers. It will not tolerate an unchecked rise of China, but we should remember that a rise of China is not inevitable. And I'll come to a conclusion here. Look, I don't think this is the focus of the talk, and possibly by ending on this, it might mean that you will discuss this more, and I'm not sure if that's what I intended, but I think it's important. What is the class nature of the Chinese state? Now, I don't think we are doctrinaire textbook the way doctrinaire textbook Trotskyists operate, that if your textbook says China is a deformed workers' state or is a bureaucratic, therefore our position must be X. I don't think our politics works directly like that, but I do think that the class nature of the Chinese state has a longer term impact. In Brzezinski's book, he does, and in other books, the idea that China, a country of nearly 1.5 billion people, will just remain stable and homogeneously in support of the Chinese Communist Party rule. There could be massive economic and other upheavals. So I think, though, that the class nature of the Chinese state doesn't really affect what our position is in Britain, Australia, or the United States in terms of the rise of AUKUS, the rise of conflict with China. We oppose our own government's position. We oppose our own imperialism, and we are for a working class defense and foreign policy, which is building power in our own countries for the working class to be in control, and to extend that into Asia, where we want to have peaceful relations and expand working class power in collaboration with our comrades in China and the rest of Asia. But what is China? A deformed workers' state, a bureaucratic state capitalist, authoritarian capitalist, or imperialist? I'm not sure. I think it is some form of state bureaucracy that tries to use, as Deng Xiaoping said, the black cat and the white cat, they both catch the mouse, while maintaining a pretty brutal political dictatorship. Brzezinski on China said, I thought this was interesting, and I'll end here and open it up for discussion about what we think we can do. The proclaimed communism of the Chinese dictatorship is progressively less a matter of ideological commitment and more a matter of bureaucratic vested interest. The Chinese political elite remains organized as a self-contained, rigid, disciplined, monopolistically intolerant hierarchy, still ritualistically proclaiming its fidelity to a dogma that is said to justify its power, but that the same elite is no longer implementing socially. At some point, these two dimensions of life will collide head-on unless Chinese politics begins to adapt gradually to the social imperatives of China's economics. So I think China remains, to me, and I hope there are people better versed on China internally, but I think the main thing that we need to do is try to find ways to build up an anti-militarism within the left to fight AUKUS, and that doesn't exist at the moment. And hopefully, by thinking these things through and using that to build our activity, we can strike a blow against AUKUS, which is what we're trying to do here through Labour Against War.
Thank you, Marcus. That was really interesting. Um, now we seem to have a problem with hands. There aren't any. Would anybody like to say something, please? Not one. Not one raised.
No, but can you hold on? There's 4 people in the list. We have to promote them. Just wait. Yeah.
Okay.
Mike first.
Hi, thanks, Marcus. That's extremely useful. A lot of that detail I had absolutely no idea about. Um, uh, but very interesting in terms of the what's going on is the very explicit neo-colonial, in essence, colonial. It's analogous in the sense the British made India pay for the British Army in India through the late 19th century. And in essence, the fact that India had to pay for the British Army in India was the primary means by which India was protected as a market for British capital. Because India had to pay for the British Army in India, the only way in which India could pay for the British Army in India was by getting sterling. And in order to get sterling, they had to trade with Britain. And in essence, what you're describing in relation to AUKUS is a mechanism by which Australia is made to pay for a substantial chunk of the US defense industry. And what's going on, in a sense, the same thing with the 5% rule is we are gradually seeing the iron fist, which has been within the velvet glove since hidden in a velvet glove since 1945. In terms of the theories of imperialism, it's reasonably clear that Nikolai Bukharin was right and Vladimir Lenin was wrong. World imperialism generates a super imperialism, an imperialist power which sits on top of the other imperialist powers and holds the other imperialist powers in subordination. And that was already true when the Netherlands invaded Britain in 1688 in order to secure Britain as as it was for 10 years or so, subordinate partner to the Netherlands, but also but very clearly in relation to Britain. And where that comes in is, I think that Marcus, that you underestimate the degree of dominance of the UK in the politics of the middle and later 19th century. And I'm trying to remember the name of the book. David Edgerton has written about that. I think the British War Machine. Yeah. It's simply a demonstration, and it was the policy of the British Navy that Britain had to have navy capable of fighting any 2 other navies simultaneously, and that continued to be British policy until in the around 1930 the British conceded to the United States that Britain would not attempt to maintain the 2 navies policy, but would accept that the United States could build up without the British rebuilding their fleet, which of course is part of the process of the decline, in the same way as the Australian choice in 1942 is part of the decline and handover of the world gradual process. The British hand over Latin America to the United States. They agree in the course of 1914-18 that Latin America will be sold to the United States. The process of change, regime by regime, takes place through the 1920s and 1930s. They agree in 1940, in summer 1940, Britain agrees that the US will take over as the world hegemon power, and that Britain will be formally subordinate. and the Australians going over to the Americans in 1942 is part of the same story. The British tried to weasel out in 1944 with Keynes's proposals at Bretton Woods, which the United States squashes, and then they try and weasel out again at Suez in 1956, and again the United States squashes um, that effort. So my point would be simply, I'm not going to say um, we can't be in a run up to 1914 because it's too easy to underestimate the world dominance of the United Kingdom in 1914. And it's one of these odd things that the Parvus, the De Glocker guys, Parvus, Cuno, Lench, Max Beer, and these people, they understood more clearly that the UK was world dominant, and that's already visible in their writings when they were on the left before they became supporters of the German war effort around 1900. That's the one. Number two, Taiwan. This is just me. It is not. I know. I agree. The general position we favoured the voluntary unification of peoples, etc. Having said that, when it came to the crunch, the Bolshevik regime in 1917-18 had to abandon all its 1918, 1921 had to abandon all its self-determination promises to the minority nationalities. And it had to do so because if it had held on to its self-determination promises, then the imperialists would have dismembered Russia. And in reasonably clear that the United States, the original policy, you correctly corrected me on this, but the original policy of the United States was that China and Taiwan are one country, and that country's legitimate government is in Taiwan. You corrected me in the summer on this, that the United States abandoned that policy. But this ambiguity about Taiwan, the other side of it, it's not just containing the Chinese Navy within the island chain. It was already policy, and I've got a book on my bookshelves about China's naval strategy by US naval authors. It was US policy adopted in 1947, actually before the revolution, that it's an essential strategic interest of the United States that the United States should have unfettered access to the Chinese coastline. And the authors of this book, I can't remember their names, say that is still US policy. That's not changed. This is US Department of Defense policy. It is an essential security interest of the United States that US Navy should have unfettered access to the Chinese coastline. And in that context, actually, yes, we are in favor of the voluntary unification of peoples, but in relation to Taiwan, it seems to me that Taiwan is no more than a colonial possession, neo-colonial possession of the United States. And in the same way that Gibraltar is no more than an actual colonial possession of the UK. And so I wouldn't, I'm not going to say we should be gung-ho for Chinese invasion of Taiwan because it's a sort of, hey, this is very, very fucking dangerous, A, and B, it's the same error as Parvus and co. They understood that the fundamental problem with the world was British world dominance, but then they imagined that the Kaiser regime could smash it. And all the BRICS people, they understand perfectly well the fundamental problem. For capitalist, a new 1948 to 1975 74 would require the destruction of the military power of the United States. But the idea that that's going to be done by the BRICS is the same fantasy as the idea that the Kaiser regime was going to smash the British Empire, or the Hitler regime for that matter was going to smash the British Empire. So I'm sort of second, in relation to China's self-identification, it seems to me that 2008 made a big difference in this respect. You correctly referred to 2008 makes a big difference in terms of the United States' panic about declinism. You know, in the same way, I think, as the crash of 1857 triggers British panic about declinism, which continues all through the later 19th century, though they imagine that it's going to be, there's endless books about French invasion of Britain between the 1850s and the Boer War, fantasy books about and so on. But it also in China has the effect of reassertion of the we're socialist and reassertion of we cling to state control, that we're not going to play, we're not going to go down the road of financialization and opening up and fully exchangeable currency and all of those things. We're going to cling to the power of our state to defend our industry. And that is part of, I think, the process, part of why Brzezinski is out of, you said Brzezinski is out of date because of 2008. And I think that's true. Brzezinski was already out of date because of the East Asia long-term capital management crash, East Asia crash, Russia crash in 97, and then the dot-com crash in 2000. That the image of that was already the basis of Putin becoming in the ascendant in Russia, that it became apparent that the fantasies of liberalism had failed. But more strongly post 2008, and therefore the Chinese, it seems to me that has implications in relation to self-identification for the Chinese regime. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, it's Pam, and then Jim, and then Peter. So Pam, you're next.
Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. So in relation, I think Mike was referring to it, the possibility of war between the United States and China over Taiwan, and your observation that as socialists, we should support China over the United States. Does that have a parallel with Ukraine, or where we say we support neither side? They're both anti-working class. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam. Okay, Jim.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting. Just briefly on what Pam was saying. It's not a matter of we would go and support China. The main enemy is at home. Same with Russia and Ukraine. But that was very interesting in part because we don't hear much about AUKUS. It's a long way away, Australia, of course. So is Taiwan. It's a long way away from the United States, for that matter. And so they don't get much airing in the mainstream media. Taiwan, even though Britain's been sending aircraft carriers down there every now and then, which presumably wouldn't last very long if there was a war, but they've been on TV here. I watched an episode, it was advertised that an F-25, whatever it is, managed to crash off the aircraft carrier. I thought that'd be amusing. But our lads and large numbers of lasses off there to show the flag. But Australia, like the UK, is on its knees, isn't it? We do as we're told. We do as you want us to do. and so on. But what for? Yeah, for world capitalist economic reasons. But on the face of it, Australia needs defending against China. Britain needs defending against Russia. They both seem a little far-fetched on those sorts of terms. But what else is there in the mainstream media and so on, and what politicians are saying? But for the United States, the main thing is that there are no obstacles to aggression. And like you're saying about the lack of any anti-war movement coming out of the Palestine demonstrations and so on. As far as they're concerned, we can do what we like. And of course, Trump is somebody who says, I can do what I like, we can do what we like, and so on. Thank you.
Marcus, will you let me know when you'd like to come back?
Sure,
I
I'm
mean,
happy, I'm
are
happy to
you
let
okay?
it. Yeah.
Happy to let it go? Okay. There are two more people, Peter and Jack, for the moment. So Peter, and Ian Spencer. So there are three more. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Peter, Jack, Ian. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, thanks very much for that very interesting talk, Marcus. It's excellent, especially as when we consider that you're delivering it very late at night where you are. And oh, by the way, I like your Lenin appearance as well. Very, very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, I just want to make the point about China. I mean, for a long time, the SWP and its like referred to, the Soviet Union and all the Eastern European countries, etc., as state capitalist. Well, if anything, I think that description applies very well to China as it is at the moment. And it's like, I mean, it's not only individuals closely connected with the Chinese Communist Party who are, at the head of particular companies, many of which are state-owned, but they're acting just like capitalist companies, and they're expanding internationally, they're investing abroad and all the rest of it. They're behaving like capitalists. Their aim is to make a profit. So I think state capitalism is the way that China is developing. There's lots of it's not so simple as that, but I think that is a factor that should be considered because it's China's arrival to US hegemony, but at the same time, it does have some overlapping interests because of its nature. Okay, so that's just my thoughts on it for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Jack is next, followed by Ian, followed by Yasmin.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I was at, and I will be later today, hopefully, along with Yasmin. We were at the only observers and on Zoom, but we were at the MUG. I don't know whether they call it a conference, convention. I think they called it a congress. So a congress. Either way, I was pleased by quite a lot of their votes, and I was really happy with the advanced level and the participation of comrades. It was really quite a joy to watch, actually. But one thing, especially in light of your talk and my outlook, I mean, I've been writing on certainly the war question throughout Ukraine, if not, and well before. But we had a vote there. Basically, I mean, I won't give you chapter and verse, but basically along the lines that there's not going to be, not N-O-T, a hot war between the United States and China. And the expectation amongst the comrades really was of proxy wars. Now, maybe they're right, but my own view precisely is that with proxy wars, there's the danger of going towards a hot war. And while I don't agree with Mike that, you know, it's an instant general, well, Mike might be right. You know, so I'm, you know, I might emerge from the cinders and say Mike was right. But either way, I think that the tendency is there. And I think that's why I agree with the overall thrust of your talk. And I do think that the comrades in the United States have got it wrong. The worst thing to do in politics, in my humble opinion, is to look at what is and to imagine it will just continue. We need to actually go beneath the surface and locate. And I don't think that's very difficult to tell the truth. Okay, so that's just one comment. Okay, you obviously couldn't but help mention Trump. But this takes me back to the Brzezinski thing. Okay, I don't know whether he's read Brzezinski. Apparently, he's only read one book in his life. Maybe sort of true. I'm not mocking him, by the way. I don't think he's stupid. But he's not a book man. He's not a book. You know, he's not like that. He's TV, and he'd be talking, and he'd be advised. And as I say, he's no fool. So, okay, no fool. He wants peace. He wants to do a deal in Ukraine with Russia. And at the moment, I haven't read what that's about. I haven't read anything in foreign policy or, hey, here's my big playbook. But it only makes sense to me, right? Because you've got Russia bogged down. How many Americans have died? You talked about the British and American defense industry base being whatever. I can't remember, but I don't agree with you. For America, Ukraine has been a boon and a boom. You know, just look at the profits. The same will be true in Britain, except on a smaller scale. But for America, you know, they can't produce enough, and they will be, you know, what's the word? Ramping up. So it's profit. So we've got to sort of at least hazard a guess. What the hell is Trump doing? Is he just wanting the Nobel Peace Prize, or is there a bigger plan? I think it's China. He hasn't said, you know, he hasn't said I want peace with China too. I mean, of course he has on some level, but in a serious way, there's no difference between him and Biden that I can detect there. He's going to bung on swinging sanctions. So is the aim to cleave away Russia or neutralize Russia? I mean, again, I have written, I mean, I do take not the rerunner towards World War I, because we live in a different world, but I take that sort of world seriously. And again, not saying there's any profundity there, but just look at the run up to World War I. Mike mentioned, you know, from the 1880s and all the rest of it. Look at how the strategy changed. Britain aligns itself with the old enemy, France. You know, so you go from this novels about French troops landing and all the rest of it, and then they bring Russia on board. Well, then, you know, France has already